China's president says his country and Russia are driving geopolitical changes globally. Xi Jinping has been in Moscow in a show of support for Vladimir Putin. But what do those changes mean for the broader world order? And how does the West view Xi's visit? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the program. I'm Nastasia Tay. Now, President Xi Jinping has concluded his visit to Moscow, cementing his partnership with Vladimir Putin. The Chinese leader's trip came just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president for war crimes in Ukraine. The two heads of state issued a joint statement confirming their alignment on a host of issues and condemning the West and NATO. They also cautioned against any steps that could push the conflict in Ukraine into an uncontrollable phase. Hashim Al-Bara reports.
They say it's an alliance without limits. China and Russia are expanding trade and diplomatic cooperation. The two countries insist their relations are far from being a military and political alliance. But Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin share a growing concern of what they perceive to be an American dominance across the globe. For the Chinese leader who secured an unprecedented third term earlier this month, this trip could be the moment to establish his country as an international peacemaker.
We shall always respect and abide by the UN Charter. We will always promote peace and also promote negotiation and discussion. Our stance is always based on fairness and justice. We will always be on the side of peace. We are always on the side of dialogue. We are always on the side of historic fairness and justice.
But ending war in Ukraine may not be an easy task. China is yet to elaborate on its 12-point peace plan. Beijing has called on Russia and Ukraine to address their security concerns without mentioning Russian troops' withdrawal, a key demand for Kyiv. The US has dismissed the peace plan as a stalling tactic. In the meantime, Western nations are stepping up military assistance to Ukraine.
Today we learnt that the Minister of Defence of the UK declared he would supply tanks to the Ukraine and also uranium-enriched weapons to Ukraine. I think that the West will now fight Russia to the last Ukrainian.
Facing growing international isolation, Vladimir Putin is turning to President Xi Jinping, an alliance largely shaped following Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. After the EU imposed a ban on Russian energy imports, China stepped in, buying large quantities of cheap Russian oil, providing cash-strapped Moscow with much-needed revenue. The US considers China the biggest threat to its national security and fears Beijing could be exploiting Russia's embattled standing to expand its geopolitical influence. Hashim Al-Bara, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Moscow, we have Sergei Markov. He's director of the Institute of Political Studies in Moscow. He was also a former public spokesman for President Putin. In Beijing is Huiyao Wang. He's founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization think tank. And in Washington, D.C. is Toby Gatti. She's a specialist in Russia-US relations. She's also a former special assistant to President Bill Clinton and a former senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasian states at the U.S. National Security Council. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today on Inside Story. I believe this was, the 40th time that Putin and Xi have met? That's quite remarkable. I know they've previously celebrated birthdays together, made dumplings together, pledged their friendship without limits. Sergei, I know you have been very close with President Putin in the past. How would you characterize the Xi-Putin relationship?
First of all, Vladimir Putin and Xi has a very good personal relationship because they respect each other very much. Vladimir Putin respects Xi because he is managing a huge ship, which is almost, big civilization, Chinese civilization, towards the global leadership in the future. And we know that China is developing more quickly than other civilizations. And she respects Vladimir Putin very much because Vladimir Putin is a real fighter, and because Vladimir Putin very moral personality. If she compare Vladimir Putin with Western leaders, it's absolutely clear that most of the Western leaders, such as Biden or Scholz or Macron or numerous British prime minister, they are quite immoral personalities which lying every time and which try to impose their own position to another country. And they're talking endlessly about democracy, but support 100% anti-democratic repressive regime in Ukraine. Also, Russia and China, they have to work together because both of them under the aggression of the United States and America-led big coalition, which include almost 50 countries in the world.
Well, you say, I'm sorry, Sergei, I want to bring in Henry here because you say that this is also about countering some kind of aggression from the West. And I see more language has come out of this visit, very similar to what we saw in February last year. And that was, 20 days just before the Russian invasion. Now they've signed a joint statement titled Deepening the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for the New Era and Stress Settling the Ukraine Crisis Through Dialogue. That's a lot to cover in less than 3 days. And I noticed that Ukraine actually only gets a mention in point 9 of 9. Henry, for Beijing, is this about Ukraine or is this more about a push for this so-called new era?
Well, I think that actually President Xi's visit is very timely. And of course, China just finished the 2 section. We got a new, terms of the government all sworn in and new state council. So traditionally, China and Russia have enjoyed good relations. They have the longest borders in the world. I mean, so that's always a tradition that they have both countries in good terms. But I think more significantly is that this time, as the foreign ministry spokesperson mentioned, this is a peace mission. Just before President Xi's visit, China Foreign Minister Qin Gang actually spoke to Ukraine Foreign Minister, and also China top diplomat Wang has met Ukraine Foreign Minister in Munich, where I was in Munich conference, attending that conference as well. So I think there's a lot of dialogue already. And also on top of that, China just published this 12-point peace position paper that outlined China's peace plan for Ukraine-Russian conflict. And also, of course, that China just broke the deal between Iran and the Saudis on the peace as well, diplomatic ties. Indeed. So I think this time China went in to understand both positions, to really talking to President Putin and, of course, find out what's going on. Okay. And I think, it's really good. Of course, we have many bilateral relations issues too. So
Henry,
it's really...
I want to look at the peace plan in more detail in just a moment, but I do want to bring in Toby here, because from the language that we've heard in these joint statements, and these are really hefty things, a huge amount of language that both foreign policy staffs have had to agree on in minute detail, it seems that the biggest thing that Beijing and Moscow have in common is the desire to counter US dominance. Toby, how is all of this being viewed in Washington? Henry says this is a peace mission.
Well, it may be a peace mission, but for China, it's a peace mission for a piece of the Russian economy, for a lot of Russian energy, and for many things that are much more important to China than the fate of Ukraine. And the alternative reality that we see in the Kremlin in a meeting like this does not reflect the fact that Russia is a declining power in terms of China, and China's biggest fear is that Russia will not be able to handle the war in Ukraine, and it will lead to instability. China's fear has always been instability on the part of many different countries. And I really think you're seeing a change in many relationships. Just remember what's happening in the room is important. Image is important for both publics, certainly for Putin's public, having been declared a war criminal last week and having called Memorial, which is an organization dedicated to exposing Soviet problems in the 1930s and 40s. having closed it this week, this meeting is important to show that these two leaders can talk to each other. But make no mistake about it, China has a very clear agenda. China is a rising power, and Russia is just barely holding on. And I think it's really important that Russia's main leverage over China is the fear that Russia will be unstable. And China does not want that, doesn't want it because they have a long border and also because of U.S. concerns. But this meeting did expand bilateral
I will
relations.
look at that in a minute, but I want to touch on something that you just spoke about there, this level of instability. As you say, a hugely long border. Let's throw this to Sergei, and I want to take apart a little bit this Chinese peace plan, this 12-point peace plan. It has been criticized in many places, including in Washington, for not being a roadmap to peace, for not being concrete enough. How is it being viewed in Moscow?
In Moscow, this Chinese plan viewing as very positively because this not so much plan, but more principles of the peace resolution of the conflict. Russia very interesting about peace resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, because from our point of view, it's some kind of civil war between two wings of the Russian people. From our position, Ukrainians is same as Russians, part of the big Russian people. And so we're very interesting about stopping this war. We believe this is war, not war between Russia and Ukraine, but this war between Russia and United States of America, and it's United States of America aggression against Russia using occupation of the Ukraine from 2014, when United States overthrown last democratically elected president of Ukraine and opposed dictatorship, Russophobic, xenophobic regime to Ukrainian people and use Ukrainian army as proxy army. So we were very interesting to stop this war. But at the same time, Chinese plan, it's, as already mentioned, not so much plan, but more principles. Now, the time for the Chinese principles didn't come yet, because Washington, if you may know, are very clearly against peace negotiation with Russia over the peace in Ukraine. United States wants only war and killing and war. That's why we will have to come through the spring period of the intensive fighting between Russian and Ukrainian proxy American army. And after this,
Sergei, I want to throw this back to Toby here, because you say the Americans have no interest in ending the war. Toby, do you think that's the case? And I'm okay. Go for it.
Okay, I mean, the Chinese, it's very good the Chinese came forward with principles because the United Nations also has principles. And if China really cared about principles, it wouldn't have abstained on the resolution in the Security Council on the war. Those were the principles. That was the UN. That's the forum. The Chinese don't really want to do the hard work of making peace in Ukraine. And it's far from them. Ukraine's far from them. They have many, many interests in Asia. And I can understand that. And so for the Russians to think that the Chinese are going to play any large role, I mean, imagine the conversation where Xi has to tell Putin what Zelensky has told him about Russia's policy. I don't see this happening. This is not a Chinese role. Well, I think the Chinese have their own interests.
Let's
their
ask
development
that question
model,
then
nothing to do with Russia.
To our guest from Beijing, in terms of the role that China hopes to play here. Henry, I'm curious about where China sees this conversation going and where this desire to become such a mediator is coming from. You mentioned the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're obviously trying to become a bit of a broker on the global stage, but specifically, it seems, on issues where their own interests at stake. Is this about reputation building for Xi, or does it go beyond that?
Well, certainly it's raised to China's reputation, of course, and China is trying to promote the talks and peace and all together. I think right now, as we hear that, Russian-Ukraine's conflict, but behind Ukraine, you got NATO, you got Western countries. So China is actually busy talking to not only to President Putin, but also to Western leaders. We're having Scholz came here that they said, okay, there's no nuclear weapon should be used. But also we're having the French President Macron is coming, Italian Prime Minister coming, Spanish Prime Minister coming, European President will coming, German Foreign Minister coming as well. So you have a host of the people have a stake in the fight that actually talking to the Chinese. So I think, we probably also thought leaders will talk to Zelensky at some point of time. So I think, China's position,
Henry,
even though it's more in principle,
Henry,
but
you
also
say a number of
lot
people are speaking to China. I wonder, is there perhaps more space now for China to act as a mediator, given the timing? We've now seen this arrest warrant issued for Putin by the ICC. That could potentially limit his ability to travel or to dialogue with other leaders. Toby, do you think that creates more space for Beijing?
Well, I think Beijing ought to stop looking at what's happening at NATO and look what happened yesterday. The Japanese prime minister was in Bucha, was in Ukraine. So I think the world around China is changing in a way maybe that China is not too happy about, increased military spending in Asia. So the consequence of this war for China are very great. And, China, you talk about the Iran-Saudi agreement. Remember, there were talks for 2 years. And then China came in at the last minute and brokered the agreement. These things take a long, long time. I don't think China is going to invest in peace in Ukraine, but it is very interested in having Russia remain a stable country, a weaker country than China for sure, economically. And the agreements that are signed are very much in China's interest. Fuel and oil and gas to China and Chinese business in Russia. But just remember, the U.S. interest in talking to China is going to focus on one thing very clearly. Do not send weapons to Ukraine.
I want to get to the weapons in a minute,
then it's
Toby.
a very different ballgame.
But one of the things you mentioned there is these very, very comprehensive agreements that we've seen. And it goes well beyond the kind of broader economics that we would necessarily expect. I noticed that it also now says that the main state-owned broadcasters of the two countries are going to be sharing content. Now, Sergey, I know you know how powerful a cultural voice or influence is. What's that aimed at here?
At sharing, excuse me, sharing what?
At sharing content. So the two broadcasters from the two different countries, the state broadcasters, have agreed to share content. And let me throw this to Sergey. I'm curious about what you think they're trying to aim at here in terms of trying to create a broader cultural influence to counter the West, perhaps?
Not so much against the West. It's first of all, Russia and China has to stay together against United States of America. Because from both Russian and Chinese point of view, we are interested to cooperate with Europe, but Europe under the US domination, imperialist domination, I would say, United States are prohibited to the Europe to cooperate with both China and Russia. So Russia and China interesting about liberation of Europe against American imperialist hegemony and domination. So both countries are interesting to develop such a relationship.
We might as well be in the 1950s. We are. Listen to this. Listen to what we're hearing. The words. It's like a bad dream. It really is. And I don't think China wants to be part of this bad dream. China's relations with the West are just too broad, and economics matter too much. Sergey, keep sending China all your oil and gas. They'll be very happy. They can resell it to Europe as they've been doing and make money. This is a death spiral for Russia. Russia is not going to be an independent country.
I do want to make sure that Henry's also part of this conversation and giving the Chinese point of view here, because as you say, economics is critical. You mentioned earlier that there was a speculation about whether or not China might supply arms to Russia in this conflict. That's obviously a very fine line. I know China has said there are no forbidden areas of cooperation, but that was before the Russian invasion. Henry, this is a really, really, fine balancing act here. How's that going?
Well, this time we haven't heard the no limit talking this time, but certainly, I mean, economic and trade relation has always been improving. China wants to maintain good relations with all its neighbors. Of course, Russia being the largest neighbor, China certainly wants to maintain good relations. But same is true with India, with Japan, with Vietnam, with everyone. I mean, it's just now I think China and Russia, they share a lot of. Same as I said, they've been both bashing very hard by the U.S., particularly China. China is even put before Russian as U.S. Number one rivalry. So I think that is the case that we want to maintain a global UN type of order that all the countries has to be really have its own right to develop and have its own pursue its own
so to be very
globalization.
clear here, Henry, you don't see China at any point wanting to send weapons or arm Russia in any way, because then it would potentially face the same sanctions that Russia's facing.
Well, China has said that many times. I mean, China Defense Minister last year said that the Shangri-La Dialogue, China does not provide any material or military support to Russia, and China only provided the humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So I don't think China has violated that. China has actually been repeatedly saying they provide no military to the Russian for this fighting this war. So I think that has been very clear. I think I have wrote the op-ed on New York Times last year at the same time when war was broke out. We want to call it a UN 7-party talk. That's P5 plus Ukraine and the EU. Let's have a peace summit. I mean, China is the only country now that is really proposing peace talks, and we have to end this by peace talk, not by continuous fighting on that.
Henry,
so I think it's really important that we sit down and talk.
Sure. You speak there about a global order, and one of the things that I found very interesting coming out of this visit now, Xi in Russia, was that Putin seems to have endorsed the Chinese yuan as the currency of choice over the US dollar or the euro. And he's now, I believe, encouraging the developing world to also use it in its dealings with Russia. Sergei, from the Russian perspective, what does this multipolar economic order look like?
Russia believes that multipolar world is exactly international democracy. And that United States and Europe should respect the multipolarity of the world, and also that different nations has a right to choose different political and cultural system and different religious system. And it's on another hand, that's politically, that pluralist, the world should be pluralist. And of course, the United States, who've been one polar of this global world, resisting to this historical trend. That's why we believe that we are, Russia and China, on the right side of the history, on the history of progress, and United States against progress.
So we are clearly seeing a broader realignment here. Sergei, you're saying that this is about diversity, wanting a multipolar world for that reason. Toby, I want to ask you, because I wonder if the view from Washington is that this is now becoming two blocks, the West and Europe perhaps, and the West broadly on one side, Russia and China on the other. Is that the view, and where does that leave the developing world?
I don't think that's the view. I think Russia is developing a war economy, increasing its army, sending more troops to Ukraine, controlling its society. China has no interest in a war economy. The economic model of Russia has nothing to offer to Chinese development. It's hard to have an international currency based on China's currency. China uses the dollar. China wants trade with Europe. That's one of the reasons they have good relations with Belarus, because that's the opening to Europe. They're not giving up on Europe because of Ukraine. That is for sure. So I really don't see the world divided that way. I think the Chinese leadership is very aware of China's rise. And when you have a rising power, you can afford to be a little more flexible. It's when you're on the defensive and you feel the world is really against you, which is how Russia feels, that you make mistakes. And I really worry about that, because China doesn't mind having a dependent Russia or a weak Russia, but it does not want a Russia that is not stable. And that is why this meeting was so important, because it shows China and Russia together as stable countries. This is for a domestic audience. A lot of this,
Toby, I'm interested in something that you just said there. This idea that Russia is on the defensive and that China perhaps isn't. But we have been hearing some quite interesting language come out of China. President Xi has been criticizing the US's, and I quote here, all-round containment, encirclement, and suppression of China. Henry, that's some very deliberate Cold War language there.
Well, we see the Cold War deeds, actually. You know, now U.S. is practicing more. I mean, we have 1,000 Chinese companies being on the sanction or entity list of UN. We have a CHIPS Act. We have AUKUS, just, building the nuclear submarines. And then we have Quad, and we have, IPAF. We have, Five Eyes and NATO's. I mean, China is really pursuing economic globalization. China wants to do Belt and Road, AIB, and RCEP, CPTPP, DPA, and all those things. So I see a different model of a pursuit, because U.S. really secure more militarization and, of course, security alliances. China is pursuing more economic alliances, including with China Africa, China Arab, China Latin America, China Central Asia. So I think, in the end, probably economic globalization will have to go back to the basics. The economic globalization will prevail, because that's really bread and butter of everybody. And we have to we see the banks collapsing in U.S. and in Europe. We will have to really come to the basics and not really fighting this geopolitical war. Let's go back. Let's stop the war, and let's really pursue peace and economic globalization. It's not perfect, but let's improve it. Let's enhance it. And strengthen the WTO, WHO, and let's work together. That's most important. And also, with the Ukraine-Russian conflict, let's get G7. P5 plus Ukraine to talk, and let's have a peace summit. I mean, and the UN umbrella, and let's make things move forward, and not really have to start somewhere.
Very interesting. It does feel like, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, but I do feel like we're seeing a world now where economics is perhaps trumping politics here. We'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you to all of our guests, Sergei Markov, Henry Huiyao Wang, and Toby Gatti. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Anastasia Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.